Joseph, tell us all about Henry James.
Henry James. Well, Henry James. Of course, you know who Henry James was.
We'll take it. We'll assume that our erudite viewers,
the great American novelist, who was born in 1843, died in 1916. Actually, it's his anniversary, 100 years ago.
Oh, it is.
I don't hear much talk about that. Which is strange.
No. They're all going on about Shakespeare.
Oh, well, who was Shakespeare?
some weird guy with long hair back in the.
Well, Henry James is a very fascinating novelist. He came from a very unique family. They say his country was his family. He had a grandfather from Ireland, a father who was a Swedenborgian philosopher, Henry James Sr., who was actually quite famous in his time. He was a friend of Emerson and all those kind of people. His father lost his leg in a fire when he was young and had gone through great suffering, and also had undergone what's called a spiritual vastation, where he had a kind of a vision of ultimate reality. Now, he produced two great sons, William, who was the great philosopher, and Henry, who was a great novelist.
Okay.
In all his life, Henry was overshadowed by William, because William had a glorious career in Harvard, and Henry went off to live on the continent at first, and then in London, and wrote novels which his brother thought were very frivolous. The theme of his novels was the so-called international theme. A young, innocent American girl comes to Europe, anxious to live to the full, falls prey to sinister people in Europe. Sometimes they're actually Americans who have become Europeanized.
Yeah, but a lot of them are Italian, though.
Well, not really.
No, like Fosco, in The Woman in White, in The Woman in I'm thinking I'm more into Wilkie Collins.
Fosco, The Woman in White. I haven't really read that novel. I must read it.
I like Wilkie Collins myself. Yeah.
Anyway, for example, Daisy Miller was his first and almost only commercial success. And it's true that Daisy comes to grief because of her affair with an Italian man. But that's not the real cause of her tragedy. The real cause is that the narrator of the story, whose name is Winterbourne, who has got the puritanical mentality and is judging her. He's judging her as a loose, reckless girl.
Right.
And it's because of his judgment on her that she dies. So this is typical of Henry James. He is deeply anti-puritanical. This is one of the keys to understanding what Henry James is up to.
Well, a lot of the novelists of that time weren't they? Dickens, for example, was very anti-Puritan. You get a lot, and you like Jane Eyre, for example, Charlotte Bronte. She's got, Puritans are hypocrites, basically.
Yes.
Mostly. I mean, for a lot of these writers, they were on a sort of anti-Puritan crusade, really.
Well, Nathaniel Hawthorne was.
Yeah.
He's seen people quote the Scarlet Letter, but that's a very anti-puritanical novel.
Yeah, yeah.
And Henry James actually admired Hawthorne a lot, and he wrote a book about Hawthorne, but he thought that Hawthorne, that no literary genius could flourish in America. America was barren soil. So that's why he fled to Europe to get inspiration and to get stimulation. But at the end of his life, he made a very interesting comment. He said, "My life in Europe has been a catastrophe. If I had to begin all over again, I would become truly American. I would love my continent. I would embrace it. I would espouse its rhythms of life." And he might have been a greater novelist if he had done that. Strange to say.
Well, he's a great stylist, though, wasn't he? He's
a tremendous stylist.
He does write rather beautifully.
Absolutely. And he did that from day one. At the age of 20, he was writing perfectly beautiful English.
Right. Now, it's very lucid and... It's not full of frills. It says it very
every
nicely,
word. No word is wasted. Even though the sentences can be extremely long, everything is saying something, right?
Yeah.
Now, the great moment in Henry James's development, according to me anyway, is The Portrait of a Lady, which is perhaps his most famous novel.
Yeah.
He read Middlemarch by George Eliot. Now, he had a little bit of bad feeling towards George Eliot because he had presented her with a copy of his first novel. And when he went back to visit her lover...
the guy she lived with, yes, I can't remember his name.
He came down the path as he was leaving and said, "Please take this back." It was the novel he had given her, which he hadn't even opened.
Wow.
And anyway, he read Middlemarch and he wrote a review, which is not very flattering. He says it's a very wonderful novel, but there's no shape, form, or design to it. It's just an everything dumped into it. So he decided that his novel, A Portrait of a Lady, would be a perfectly, formally beautiful work of art.
Right.
Now, it's true that George Eliot's novel, has more living human beings. Dorothea is a more real woman than Isabel, the heroine of James's novel. But in James's novel, there's an amazing moment where Isabel at night looks into the dying embers of a fire and realizes the truth about her whole life, how she has been lured into a loveless marriage by a deceiving husband who is actually a very Italianized American.
Right.
And the whole chapter is a drama in her consciousness. And this is the birth of the later James, the novelist of consciousness and of consciousness only. But James didn't follow that path immediately. He wrote a political novel called The Princess Casamassima. He wrote another long novel called The Tragic Muse, which are heavy, lumpish works. And then he decided, I'm going to become a playwright. I'm going to wow the public with my wonderful dramas. And that was the worst failure of his whole life.
I didn't even know he'd done that. No,
5 years of horrible plays. Nobody reads them even, much less theatrical success. One of them is called Daisy Miller. He takes up that story of Daisy Miller and gives it a happy ending where Daisy marries, not the Italian, but Winterbourne.
Oh dear.
It's prostitution. And at that stage, in 1995, James was booed off the stage.
Right.
And by a strange coincidence, Colm Tóibín and David Lodge at the same time wrote novels about Henry James, both of them beginning with that incident of James being booed was the most dramatic incident.
Who and David Lodge, did you say?
David Lodge and Colm Tóibín, the Irish novelist, won the Booker Prize. David Lodge was very disappointed because Tóibín stole the show. So then David Lodge wrote a book called The Year of Henry James, recounting his humiliation and his frustration.
It must be I have another person writing a book on the same thing as you're doing.
I would love to read that book by Lodge, The Year of Henry James.
I like David Lodge, actually. I like David Lodge. He's a good.
Anyway, after that, James returned to the art of the novel and the art of the short story, or the
he wrote the short stories.
He wrote 120 of them. They're all masterpieces.
Yeah.
His 20 novels are not all masterpieces, but they're all very interesting.
Right. No, my mum was a great reader of Henry James. Yeah.
Oh, so did you read your Henry James at your mother's knee?
No, I don't know that she read it necessarily when I was a kid. I think it's something she came to later on in life. You know, but, I mean, she was in her 90s when she died earlier this year, and she read voraciously right up until the end. You know. So
have you any idea what novels?
I think anything and everything. I think if it was by Henry James, she would give it a whirl. Yeah, and she'd give it a spin, as it were.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
But James then culminated his career with the famous 3 novels called The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, and The Golden Boat, which are extremely long, extremely elaborate, and extremely great novels.
Right.
The Ambassadors is about a man who comes to Paris from Puritan New England to bring back the erring son of a woman with whom he has an attachment and who is kind of blackmailing him. If he toes the line, she might marry him. This is a man at age 55. He comes to Paris. He realizes, to his horror, that he has wasted his whole life, that he should have lived in Paris, where he spent a few months as a young man. And then he finds that the woman's son has been miraculously transformed by his stay in Paris, has become an extraordinarily cultivated, elegant young man. So he can't bring himself to tell the young man, come back home to mother. He says instead, that woman who has done such wonders for you, namely a certain Madame de Vionnet, you should reciprocate her love, and so on and so forth. And the young man, to his horror, says, I've had enough of this. I want to go back and be a successful businessman. And the narrator is left alone, and he resolves he will live in Paris for the rest of his life and dump the whole lot of his Puritan American friends. Then the second novel, The Wings of the Dove, a very powerful novel about betrayal and guilt. And it's the typical Jamesian story. A dying American woman, very rich, but aware that she has a fatal disease. She wants to live life to the full before she dies. She wants to experience everything, and of course she wants to experience the sacred passion of love. Well,
I should hope so.
Well, it so happens that there's a scheming couple, and I think they're British. I think they're both British. Yes, Kate Croy. The first lines of the novel are, "She waited, Kate Croy. She's like a bird of prey,
right?
And she's manipulating the feckless Merton Densher. And she tells Merton, you know, we can make a tidy killing for ourselves if you were to amuse our rich American friend in her final years so that she leaves you her fortune."
Right. Okay, so we're going to have a Henry James reprise, Joseph. And you were talking about The Wings of Dove and Novels of Consciousness and so on. So.
That's right. Last week we talked with Henry James and we got as far as The Wings of the Dove, which I think is James's greatest work.
Right.
Why? Because it's the only work of his that has tragic power. You touch on tragedy, and his other novels never quite get there. I think when you were studying in Cambridge, tragedy was considered the highest form of literary art. Am I correct?
You had to do tragedy. You could not escape.
Yes, well, with James, you want to do tragedy. I really think The Wings of the Dove is the only novel where you get tragic power.
Right.
Now, James, strangely enough, in his preface to that novel, in the second edition, the New York edition, he's extremely negative about the novel. He says that it begins very well. He laid out a wonderful, broad world, a whole world of people, and then it dwindles away and becomes cramped, and the second half is false, he even says. Now, this is this is really James putting himself down, I think, incorrectly. It's true that the first half of the novel, James plunges into three powerful consciousnesses, Kate Croy and Millie Thiel, the dark girl and the fair girl of the mythological lineup. You know Leslie Fiedler, Leslie Fiedler, Love and Death in the American Novel, just with the archetypal American contrast of the dark
and the
lady and the fair lady.
Right.
And something like Becky Sharp, the dark lady, and Amelia Sedley, the fair lady.
The fair one, yes, yeah.
But in between is hapless Densher, who's a nobody. He's a journalist of some sort, is he? Anyway, he doesn't have any personality. He has no will. This is his real defect. But we have these three fascinating characters, and James plunges into the consciousness of each of the three in turn.
Right.
And it's all set in London and is a vast world. But then the second half of the novel is mostly set in Venice, and is almost exclusively, if I remember correctly, Densher's consciousness.
Right.
And Densher is an extremely false position, and James loves false positions. His false position is this. He's encouraged by Kate, his girlfriend, his secret fiancée, to, in the old sense of the word, to make love to Millie, who is dying.
Right.
Console her dying years, kind of is the idea. It's a very noble thing. And of course, then when she leaves us her money, we can live happily ever after. So the situation is intrinsically highly dubious, and it's the most extraordinary analysis of a self-deceiving moral conscience being manipulated by other people. I brought the novel along, and if you want the subtleties of Henry James, any page you open is going to plunge you into the most amazing convolutions and labyrinths and
Go on.
dark corridors.
Give us an example.
If I can find out. There was one passage I thought would be suitable to read. Well, listen to this. It was constantly Densher's view that, as between himself and Kate, things were understood without saying.
Oh, yeah.
So that he could catch in her, as she but too freely could in him, innumerable signs of it, the whole soft breath of consciousness meeting and promoting consciousness. Well, just that one sentence.
Yeah.
Now, do you think there are other novels where, surely this is part of life? I mean, people feel that they can understand each other.
They're on the same wavelength.
They're on the same wavelength, and they don't need to be explicit.
Right.
This is so much part of life that I think it must be part of literature too, but it's hard to think of any examples.
Right, right.
The only one I can think of is Fanny Price and her clerical, hopeful boyfriend in Mansfield Park.
Mansfield Park.
The word
right.
consciousness comes up a lot in that novel. It's used by Jane Austen, and
Okay.
it means this, that without talking, she's conscious of his interest in her. Or
I hadn't thought about it
things
from
like
that point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I also thought maybe The Egoist by George Meredith is full of that kind of thing too.
No.
And the thing about that is what the characters say in James doesn't always match what they're really thinking. In fact, they open their mouths in order to deceive. The characters are all liars, an awful lot of them. They're lying in some
I think a lot
way.
of more modern fiction perhaps brings that out. You get it, people like Ishiguro, that sort of failure to communicate what's really inside, and yet at some sort of level, everybody knows about it, as if it was a sort of elephant in the room that's there.
Yeah.
And yet they're failing in their surface utterances, in their surface relationship, to actualize it or to specify it, and so it gets it's a sort of tragic failure to communicate what actually everybody already knows.
That reminds me of James's greatest later short stories, The Beast in the Jungle. It's an endless affair between a man and a woman. And after she has died, he realizes he should have loved her, and his failure to love her has been the failure of his life.
Yes, yeah.
But right through the whole thing, you're being completely teased. Will they ever, for God's sake, would you ever
get to say it?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's what I mean. It's exactly like that with Stevens in The Remains of the Day, isn't it? He never actually gets to. Well, he died by the time he gets to let her know how he feels for her. It's way too late. She's already been married for many years, and her child is going to have a grandchild. And he let it all go without realizing what needed to be said at the time.
That's right. It's called Missing the Bus. And
Missing the
human
bus,
life is mostly about.
Well, he's actually Shigoro symbolises it at the end with a bus. She gets on the bus and the bus goes away, and she's standing cheerfully on the platform of the bus. And, or is he? I can't remember which way around it is now. But yes, it's basically yes. That's the.
Well, the classic example of that, of course, is Flaubert, L'Éducation Sentimentale, where the hero is in love with a married woman, and he doesn't even. He certainly never gets around to telling her he loves her, but at one stage, she is possibly thinking of leaving her husband for him or something like that, and then her child gets sick, and she swings back.
They're pretty much the same dynamic as you've got in The Remains of the Day, then.
Yeah, but 20 years later, she comes to her rooms and offers herself to him. And she takes off her scarf, and her hair is white.
Oh dear.
And he realizes it's too late.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Anyway, but continuing a little bit this paragraph.
Go on, then.
Well, at this particular point, Millie offers him her company, and he feels that Kate would encourage this because it fits in with her plan.
Mm-hmm.
He himself at this time has taken back his old apartment in Venice, and this is a sign to Kate that he wants Kate to come to him.
Right.
Because part of the story is that Kate has never had sex with him, and this is a kind of a carrot she's holding up to him. And this whole Denture character is full of sexual frustration. It's another powerful aspect of this stream of this consciousness of Denture.
Perhaps James's feeling that second part is not so successful is to do with his own experience of writing it, which has not necessarily anything to do with our experience of reading it.
Yes.
It may have cost him, an arm and a leg to write it.
Yes.
And he might have felt
he felt he had to do all sorts of shifts and tricks to get the story told.
Yeah.
But maybe that's because in another preface he says that one gets great pleasure out of doing something, but then that doesn't guarantee the reader gets any pleasure. So
well, that's the point I was making.
Yes, here he's not getting any pleasure, but the reader may be the beneficiary. Okay, I'll read it. This view, the view that they understand each other, this view was so far justified tonight as that Millie's offer to him of her company was, to his sense, taken up by Kate in spite of her doing nothing to show it. Kate says, good, Millie, it's not for younger company. Excellent. But she doesn't say anything. She doesn't need to.
Right.
The whole plot is so thick, the least little touch. He's directed, he's guided, he's manipulated by Kate.
The thing about the novel is that it tends to, as a genre, is that it tends to be based on articulation, on what is articulated, although it can go, obviously, inside the mind of the protagonists. And as I say, I think it's that the idea that it can go inside the mind of the protagonists and look at their secret motives and look at their assumptions about others is perhaps something that's more exploited in the novel now, rather than so much. Perhaps people didn't really kind of catch on to that side of it in the Victorian period.
What do you think of this? There's a French philosopher, Chrétien, Jean-Louis Chrétien, who wrote a book on consciousness and the novel. And the second volume is all about Henry James. And when he was launching the book, Jean-Luc Marion, French Catholic philosopher, gave a speech introducing the book, and he said Henry James was one of those people who played God. He thought that, like God, he could look into the human consciousness and master a human consciousness.
Right.
I think this is completely false. I think James is the humblest of artists.
Right.
I would rather think of him as a bodhisattva. This is an idea of a professor in Arizona called Linda Zwinger. I haven't read her essay, it's going to be published soon, but James is a bodhisattva. He is descending into the depths of the morally compromised consciousness in a healing way, in a sense, to bring light. And James himself found himself in false positions with women several times. They expected more from him than he could give them, kind of thing.
Right.
This famous cousin of his who died, Minnie Temple, she would have liked him to marry her, and she was dropping hints in her letters, which he, of course, was either not getting or was pretending not to get.
So you're seeing him as being a sort of spiritual figure, and that is accompanied by the sort of Buddhist renunciation of sexuality that would be seen in a bodhisattva. I mean,
I'm not thinking. No, I'm not thinking of those terms. No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
No, I think James. When James came out of his study, he looked at the world around him, and generally he was afflicted by what he saw. He saw an awful lot of falsehood and hypocrisy and manipulation, and he describes people in his novels who are, in a summary judgment, you would say, are very bad people. Densher is a cat. Kate is a manipulator. And yet, when James is writing in his authorial voice, he calls them our young friend. You know, that's the way he would allude to a character. In a sense, he's extremely non-judgmental. He lets the characters, he follows the characters into their moral labyrinth, and he, in this novel, he helps them out, because at the end, Densher is converted by the posthumous forgiveness that he receives from Millie Thiel. At least. Some people say that Millie is kind of manipulating him from beyond the grave, that she sends this message of forgiveness, you know.
Right.
But in any case, there's a moral progress in this novel. Densher is worried about not being right, not being square, and he wants to square his behavior, and he's not morally unscrupulous, but he's very morally self-deceiving, you know. And James follows that with great sympathy. Actually, there's another novel set in Venice, a novella, The Aspirin Papers, which is one of James's very best stories. And in that novel, the most powerful moment is when the narrator, who has insinuated himself into the intimacy of his landladies because he wants to get the letters of a romantic poet who is in their which are in their possession.
Right.
The poet in question would have been Byron in real life, because it is based on a real life incident. And in James's imagination, it becomes an American poet called Aspirin, right?
Right.
And the narrator is discovered prying in the old lady's cabinet late at night.
Right. Looking for these.
And she says, "You publishing scoundrel." And she seems to die. She kind of faints. But the narrator runs away and walks through the streets of Venice and goes for trips down the country, full of self-hatred, full of guilt. Right. And this is a foreplay for a preview of Densher's agonies, which go on for much longer, and
Right.
again against the Venetian setting, you know.
Mhm.
Well,
Okay, so Bodhisattva in the sense of he's a morally uplifting writer? Is it where,
see,
where you would
I,
place?
I'm just
comment?
using the word bodhisattva myself now. I mean, it's this other critic who mentioned it. I don't know what she means by it, but
All right,
what I
but
would think
your
is
angle
that
would
my
be
angle would be that what are bodhisattvas? They're Buddhist figures who refuse to vanish into nirvana. They want to come back into the suffering world and guide people to wisdom, right?
right.
So in that sense,
Okay.
James's elaborate studies of people's behaviour and especially of their consciousness, because he is really examining consciousness and conscience, moral conscience. This is the very stuff of his meditation. It's a kind of bodhisattva service. I tell you, there's another philosopher who writes about James, Robert Pippin. He's perhaps the best American Hegelian, and he wrote a book on James. And his view of James is that James is in a world where there are no moral landmarks anymore. Right? Everybody has to invent their morality as they go along. So all of these dramas of consciousness are James mapping out a moral universe in a world that has lost all bearings, you know.
Okay.
And it's mapped out not in terms of laws or anything like that, but in terms of how people treat each other, how sensitive people are, how honest people are, all sorts of very difficult and subtle kind of moral things.
Right.
And you don't know often in James's novels whether the apparently virtuous heroine is really to be taken at face value. For example, Millie is an angel and so on, and she spreads her wings and she emanates forgiveness. But Millie is the author of her own woes. She should have known that Densher was not sincerely in love with her.
Right.
And she also manipulates Densher in that sense that she is so graciously forgiving. You know.
So, but clearly you feel there's something uplifting about James.
Yes.
I mean, obviously you wouldn't be
Yes.
interested in it, and you wouldn't be calling him a bodhisattva or anything like that, would you? So it's the uplifting aspect of his. Would just to wind things up here, would you say it's the uplifting aspect of his work that most appeals to you, or?
I wouldn't say that really. I think James is great fun, and James is always complicating things. There's always an extra loop to his dialectic, if you like. I think his best characters are just fascinating. What would you call them? They're like a fascinating battlefield or